This region, abounding in gold and platina, reminded Humboldt of the gold and platina regions of Brazil. The latter produced diamonds. Why should not these produce hem also? They would, if there was any truth to his theory that nature was always true to herself, not governed by accident or caprice, but by eternal, immutable laws, of which she was at once subject and sovereign. He had already, in his essay on the bearing of rocks, directed attention to the singular analogy of mineralogical characteristics in different parts of the globe, as regards platina and gold sand. Thus, at Corrego, in Brazil, gold, platina, and palladium were found together. Near Chuego, gold and diamonds, and platina and diamonds near the river Abazet. This fact awakened in him the strongest hope of discovering diamonds in the Ural. When he arrived at any of the works, he caused the gold sand to be subjected to microscopic observations. If gold and platina were found in it, he directed the workmen to search carefully for diamonds. These examinations revealed the existence of crystals previously unknown in the gold sands of the Ural. Such crystals as in Brazil occurred in gold sand with diamonds. The travelers parted from Count Polia at Krushvix on the 1st of July. It was their intention to have accompanied him to his estates on the Kovia, in the western declivity of the Ural, but as the direct path was only practicable on horseback, and another route would have caused them to lose too much time, they abandoned the idea. The same day they proceeded to the copper mines of Bogoslik. The road led through dense forests of pine, larches, and cedars. Here and there were birches and poplars. The underwood of these forests were formed of wild rose in full bloom, and luxuriant junipers, whose dark green shade has revealed with the blue light hue of the birches. The richness and beauty of the plants contrasted strongly with the poverty of the fauna. The travelers saw hares and squirrels and such small deer, and now and then a bird. No warbling was heard in these forests. They saw several small hawks and one finch, but no civilized birds, so to speak, such as swallows, wagtails, etc. The excessive vegetation of plants abounding in sap produced myriads of gnats, which were a great torment to the travelers. To protect themselves against these gnats, the inhabitants of the country wore over their faces nets steeped in birch tar, the smell of which was offensive to the insects. Sometimes they carried pots on their backs filled with decayed wood, or they burned the fungus of the birch, the smoke of which was not injurious to the eyes, as the travelers were not prepared to meet the gnats. They suffered severely from their attacks. Their only resource was to drive away rapidly through them. When they drove slowly or stopped, they were beset and stung by swarms. Their horses were stung worse than themselves. The poor beasts were in agonies. Along the road, which was being mended at the time, were groups of peasants at work. These peasants had lighted fires as a means of defense against the gnats, and whenever they paused from their labor, they held their heads in the smoke, preferring to suffer than rather the intolerable torment of the insects. Arriving at last at Bogoslav, the travelers proceeded to visit the mines in the vicinity. The scenery here was magnificent. To the east was a broad, unbroken plain stretching away like the sea. To the west and north, 40 or 50 distant, a range of magnetic mountains. The peaks of these mountains, clad with snow, loomed over the dark forests of pine and fir that covered the intervening heights. From Bogoslav they returned to Johannesburg, stopping on their way to Marinsk. This district was rich in precious stones, topazes, beryls, amethysts, and the like. 85 versts from Johannesburg, near the granite rocks on the right bank of the Tekowaja, emeralds were found in abundance. The presence of emeralds in this neighborhood was first detected by a peasant, who was attracted one day as he was cutting wood by their lustrous sparkling in the mica, where the ground was opened around the roots of a tree, which had been blown down by the wind. He collected a quantity and took them on sale to Jekantharenburg. They were tested, fresh excavations were made, and specimens were sent to St. Petersburg. The emeralds were remarkable for their extraordinary size. One in the mineralogical collections of St. Petersburg being no less than 8 inches in length and 5 inches in diameter. The travelers arrived at Jekantharenburg on the 11th. After an absence of 16 days, they spent a week there preparing and arranging their collections, and then set out for Tobolsk, where they had arrived on the 21st. Tobolsk had been originally laid down as the eastern limit of their journey, but their speedy and easy progress through the northern Ural mountains induced Humboldt to extend his researches to the Atal, of which but little was known since the time of Paulus, Renovats, and Hermann. This scheme was strongly supported by the Governor-General. The distance from Tobolsk to Bernal was 1,500 versts, but by starting at once they could traverse it with the time prescribed for their undertaking. So providing themselves with cap nets as a defense against the gnats, they immediately commenced the journey. The road lay across a steppe through Zara and Kansk to Tomsk. The soil was firm and black, cultivated near the villages, and everywhere covered with tall herbage, interspersed with groups of birch and poplar. Between the Wagai and the Ishen, whole tracts were covered with red flowers in full blossom. Others were a deep azure. The peasants of the village through which the travelers passed appeared to be wealthy, and their horses, for the most part, were strikingly clean and neat. As the sky was unclouded, the heat was considerable. The waters of the river Ajef at noon on the 21st were 19 degrees 4 Ramor, the air being 24 degrees 6 degrees. The Ishyk was also warm, being 19 degrees near the Covenant of Oblast on the 24th. The water of the wells, however, was extremely cold. At Blashkove, the first station from Tobolsk, the water of an ordinary well free from ice was 2 degrees. Ascending the Ishtyk to Tapniakchia, they proceeded to in a southeasterly direction to the waters of the Alm, and thence easterly along its flanks across the great steppe of Baribrinsky, which reached from the Ishtyk to the Obi. Unlike the majority of steppes, which were dry and arid, this terrible waste abounded with marshes, rivers, and lakes. The soil in some places was flat and level as the sea. In others it was covered with vegetation. It was impregnated with salt, and many of the lakes contained salt water. The road was bridged in long courses over the marshy ground, but as the courses were out of repair, the traveling was tedious. The party reached Kansk on the 29th. Here they learned for the first time that the Siberian plague was raging in the neighboring villages. The physician who gave them this intelligence could afford them but little information regarding the nature of the disease, except that it broke out among the cattle and soon extended to men. It attacked men in uncovered parts of the body, in the face, neck, or arms, commencing with an injured swelling which turned to black and burning suppurations that ended in fever and death. The origin of the disease was ascribed to the stings of insects. As it was impossible to reach the Altai region by any other route, at least within the time they had allowed themselves, the travelers resolved to continue their journey, taking all possible precautions to avoid contact with the peasants among whom the plague prevailed. They even refrained from sleeping at the halting places. They found traces of the malady in all the villages. The day before their arrival, 6 persons died at Gragsha, where 500 horses had already perished. It was with considerable difficulty that they procured the means of continuing their route. Every village had a hospital of its own. Smoky fires of dry turf and dung were kept continually burning in order to purify the air. As the travelers drew near the Obi and left the steppe behind, the disease disappeared. It was never known among the mountains. They crossed the Obi at Bursk and, proceeding in a southerly direction, reached Barnaul on the morning of the 2nd of August. In 9 days they had traveled 1,000 miles. The city of Barnaul was the central point of the mining interests of the atoll. It was the seat of the authorities of the whole region and the principal location of its smelting furnaces. The most important product of the Altai was silver, the yield of which was greater than in any other part of the continent. For 50 years before Humboldt's visit, it amounted to $200,000 annually. The annual yield of the mines during the same time was 500,000 pounds of copper and 800,000 pounds of lead, notwithstanding the quantity of silver produced by the Altai. The ore from which it was obtained was very poor. Its average was only 4%, while the average of the silver ores of Mexico was from 18 to 25%. Though the working of the Altai mines were more recent than that of the Ural, the former was undoubtedly known for the earliest antiquity, for the remains of ancient mining operations were plentiful among them. These remains were generally ascribed to the Shuds, but who the Shuds were, and at what period they lived, was a mystery which no one cared to inquire into. It was enough to know that they had left the mines behind them. The actual working of the mines of the Altai owed its existence to Akinfish Niktas Demidoff, a son of the old blacksmith of Tula. With the permission and assistance of the government, he formed in 1728 great smelting establishments of Kolivask and Berglaja, and in 1739 laid the foundation of the town of Barnaul. Leaving Barnaul on the 13th, the travelers journeyed southward across the steppe of Plashkashka, the upper districts of the Obi. They visited the porphyry works of Kovlansk and the silver mines of Rudisk and the Serpent Mountain. This mountain, which derived its name from the great number of serpents found upon it, which, when it was discovered, was an immense mass of ore, the most important of which was silver. 2 versts beyond Rudisk were a comical hill called Kroshkala. Beyond Rudisk there was a comical hill called Kujala Shashka, or the Round Mountain. The vegetation of this hill, which was destitute of trees, was so dense and lofty that it prevented the travelers from seeing each other when they were a few steps away. On the 13th, they reached Ushtimashgorsk, a fortress on the frontiers of Chinese Mongolia, leaving their baggage at this post, which was guarded by a company of Cossacks who sent through their military exercises for them. They continued their journey to the gold and silver mines of Strautskis. Beyond Strautskis, they came in sight to the ranges of Plosun and Kazusha. They saw at a distance of 30 miles the Stroglushka, and still further eastward to the untrodden summit of Bezlucha, or as it was called by the Kalmuks, God's Mountain, the highest peak of the Altai. In this region, near the source of Burl, in the valley of Rashmathoka, the travelers saw remarkable hot springs. A few distant from one of these springs was one of the cold water, which flowed eastward through the turf into a small lake. They were now so near the boundary of China that Humboldt determined to pass over to Batay, the nearest Chinese Mongolian post. It was situated on the Istrisk, below Lake Sahaizan. As he had made known his wishes at Utrathmisk, a Cossack had been sent to Batay to announce his visit. There was 2 stations at this post, one at each bank of the river. The left, or Mongolian station, was occupied by Mongolian troops. The right, or Chinese station, by Chinese troops. Both were commanded by Chinese officers. Between these 2 stations on an island in the Istrisk was Mongolian and Chinese Kyiket, commanded by a captain of cavalry. Unlike the rest of the soldiers who lived in tents, this Pisk lived in the houses. They superintended the fishery carried on by the Mongols in the Chinese portion of the Istrisk, and arranged these moderate duties on salt payable to the Chinese officer. During the winter, when there was no fishing, the Mongolian part of the Kyiket returned to the village of Brashgarsh, while the Chinese retired to the town of Shuskyaskask, south of Lake Sayasan, and 450 versts from Usherminsk. The travelers visited the Chinese station first, and as their arrival was expected, they found 2 tents prepared for their reception. They were met at one of these tents by the Chinese commander and 2 attendants. He was a tall, thin young man, arrayed with the fashion of the Celestial Empire. He wore a blue silk robe reaching to his ankles, and the usual conical cap adorned with peacock feathers, which denoted his rank. His companions wore a similar dress, but had no feathers in their caps. He invited the travelers by signs to enter the tent. It was carpeted, and opposite the door stood several chests covered with carpets and pillows. He seated himself on one of these extempore couches and placed Humboldt by his side. The rest of the party sat on the other chests, or on the ground. The interpreter they had brought spoke only Mongolian, but as the Chinese commander understood that language, they were able to converse with him. He offered them tea, which was declined, and then inquired into the object of their journey. Humboldt told them that it was to inspect the mines and questioned him in turn. He told the traveler that he came direct from Pekin on horseback in 4 months, that he had not been long on the station, and that he would be sent to another in 3 years, that being the length of military service at any one station in China. Proceeding to the Mongolian post, they found the commander in his tent at the end of the avenue of poles, upon which hung fresh pieces of meat. He was dressed like his comrade on the other side, but was considerably older and very dirty, as were also his tents and attendants. As they did not understand Mongolian, or pretended not to, the conversation carried on with difficulty. Humboldt presented him with a piece of velvet, which he accepted thankfully, and offered tea, which was declined. He led the party to a temple on the bank of the Istiak. It was a small square wooden building with a door opening on the river. In the interior was an altar, and on the wall over the altar a Buddhist idol. Between the door and the river, in a kind of walled court, there was another altar with burning coals on it. Returning to their own tent, the party was visited by the first commander, who was accompanied by his 2 companions and a band of soldiers. They received him sitting, while the common Mongolians crowded around the door and looked on. The ceremonies of visitation over, he and his attendants lighted their pipes, and I smoked vigorously, urging the travelers to do the same. He tried some tobacco, which they offered him, and relished it highly, but seeing that they did not join him in his fumigation, he put up his pipe, as his good breeding would not permit him to smoke alone. Humboldt offered him a piece of blue cloth, which he declined to accept, though evidently with great reluctance. It was pushed toward him and pushed back, but very gently, several times. When he had done all that Chinese politeness required of him, under the circumstances, he accepted it, and the twinkle in his eyes showed the satisfaction that he felt. He inquired that he would offer an exchange, and the interpreter, who had received his instructions beforehand, told him that he could offer Humboldt nothing that he would value so much as Chinese books, which he had seen in his tent. They were immediately brought, and the same ceremony was again gone through with. He pushed them towards Humboldt, and Humboldt pushed them gently back. When etiquette was satisfied, he accepted them. They proved to be a famous historical novel, San Qiu Shai, containing the history of the 3 kingdoms into which China was divided after the Han Dynasty. Humboldt told the commander that he intended to give the books to his brother, who was studying the Chinese language, and the commander desired him to inscribe his name, Jin Fu, upon them. He did so, and presented him with the pencil with which he wrote. It was placed on the blue cloth and borne away by his attendants.